The captain told him plainly, "If you lie about the bridge, I'll hang you. If you tell the truth, I'll take you to the king myself." But the bridge has been creaking for a year and will collapse in 2 months, and the outpost doesn't have 100 gold pieces for the mages. But first, let's rewind. The cold hits his face before his mind even wakes up. Dan Cross opens his eyes and sees a white sky. Snow is getting into his mouth and nose. His body is lying on the rocks. His helmet has slipped back onto the back of his head. He inhales and starts coughing. His fingers are intact. His legs move. His ribs ache but don't crack. He rolls onto his side and presses his palm against the frozen granite. All around is a mountain pass, a narrow trail between 2 rock walls. The wind carries icy sleet. No city, no construction site, no elevator shaft into which he fell 3 seconds ago. Dan sits up and grabs his helmet. The helmet is still there. The vest with reflective strips is still there. A tape measure on his belt, pencils in his pocket. A notebook with calculations. A thermos. He unscrews the lid and sniffs. Cold coffee. And the world around him smells of snow and stone and something burnt. Dan looks up and sees 2 halberds aimed at his throat. 2 men stand over him. Chainmail, helmets with open visors. The tips are dull and poorly sharpened. His brain gives it away. Low-carbon steel. Heat treatment by eye. The center of gravity is shifted toward the tip, awkward in close combat. Dan orders himself to shut up because now is not the time to evaluate medieval iron. The older one is barking something. The language is foreign, but individual words stick. School German. Dan hammered it into his head for 4 semesters in college because the professor was pretty. And now it's saving his life. The older one says they need to finish off the demon in the orange helmet. The younger one replies that it's better to interrogate him first. Dan slowly raises his hands, very slowly. He pulls a notebook from his pocket and opens it to the page with a sketch of a bridge, his latest project. He drew it on the plane on the way to the site. An arch bridge. Load calculations in the corner. A moment diagram. The cross-section of the pier. He turns the notebook toward them and stammers in broken German. "I'm a builder. I can build a bridge that won't collapse." The senior guard stares intently at the drawing. At the straight lines drawn with a ruler. At the numbers. At the neat load arrows. Then he looks at Dan. Then back at the drawing. And quietly says to the junior guard, "Take him to the captain." This one isn't a demon. This one is worse. They haul Dan to his feet and drive him down the path. He walks between 2 guards and counts his steps. A habit. 412 steps to the wooden gate of the outpost. The outpost clings to a rocky ledge, a log palisade, 2 watchtowers, a barracks made of rough-hewn stone. The masonry is crude, lime mortar. The joints are loose. Dan looks at the walls and sees cracks. He sees the foundation sinking on the east side. He sees that the left watchtower is leaning 2 degrees and will collapse in a couple of years. His brain cannot look at buildings without seeing their pain. A curse. The captain waits in the barracks at a table made of crooked planks. A woman, tall, a scar across her eyebrow, short dark hair, chainmail over leather. The sword at his belt is a work sword, not a ceremonial one. Captain Adele Holt. She sizes Dan up from head to toe, hard hat, vest, an open notebook in his hands. She asks who he is. He answers that he's an engineer. The word is foreign to her. He says he's a builder. She asks where he's from. He says from far away. She remarks that that's not an answer. He doesn't argue. She asks what he can do. He says, "Build things that don't fall down." She is silent. Then she stands up and snaps, "Let's go." They go out and walk along the path to the east. After 300 steps, Dan sees a bridge, a stone arch spanning a 30-meter gorge, the only way to the outpost from the east. The bridge is old. The stone has blackened with age. Grass is pushing through the railing, and the bridge is sick. Dan notices it instantly. A crack runs down the right side of the arch from the keystone down to the support. Not along the mortar joint, right through the stone itself. Bad. Very bad. Holt says the bridge has been cracking for a year, that mages from the capital's guild came to inspect it and demanded 100 gold pieces to renew the runes. The outpost doesn't have that kind of money. The outpost has no money at all. She says, "You're a builder. Tell us what's wrong with the bridge." Dan sets his notebook down on a stone. He takes off his helmet. He walks up to the bridge. He drops to his stomach at the edge and looks under the arch. Snow is falling down his collar. He sees the underside of the arch, and a second crack, parallel to the first, even worse than he thought. He stands up and walks the entire length of the bridge. He taps the stones with the handle of his knife. He listens to the sound. A dull thud means the stone is sound. A ringing sound means a void or a crack. 7 out of 40 stones ring. He returns to his notebook and makes a note. The width of the arch, the thickness of the vault, the weight of the decorative cornice on the right. That cornice, carved, beautiful, and absolutely useless, and heavy. A ton of stone hangs right where the bridge is weakest. Someone once decided to decorate the bridge and hung a ton of dead weight on the weak spot. Dan reads the calculations and straightens up. In 2 months, the bridge will collapse. The crack is running along the line of principal stress, not along the joint. The stone is worn out. But the bridge can be saved in a week for 10 gold pieces. Remove the cornice because it's pressing a ton where it shouldn't be. Place 2 wooden supports under the arch at the points he marks. It'll take 8 men and a saw. Holt is silent for a long time. The wind is tearing at her hair. She looks at the bridge, at the drawing, at Dan, and says simply, "Lie. I'll hang you. Tell the truth. I'll take you to the king personally." Dan nods. The terms are clear. The next morning, he stands on the bridge with 8 soldiers who don't understand what they're doing. Dan doesn't fully understand either. He's a structural engineer, not a bridge builder. But physics is physics. Structural mechanics is structural mechanics. Load is load. First, he marks the points. He stretches out strings. He shows where to cut. It takes half a day to remove the cornice. The stones sit on lime mortar and some bluish gunk that glows in the light. Runes. Magic mortar. Dan touches it with his finger. His finger stays in place. The mortar is as hard as epoxy, maybe harder. He writes in his notebook, "Runic mortar, stronger than usual." By how much? Needs testing. They remove the cornice and the bridge shudders. Everyone freezes. Not Dan. He was expecting this. The bridge shed the excess weight and redistributed the load. The crack didn't grow. A good sign. On the 3rd day, they set up supports. Dan picks out 2 logs. He trims the ends himself because the soldiers don't get why a flat bearing surface is needed. He places the supports at a 60-degree angle to the base of the arch. He wedges them in. He checks the plumb line. On the 4th day, he fills the cracks with a mortar of lime and sand. Ordinary mortar, no magic. The border guards look at him like he's crazy. Without runes, the mortar won't hold, they say. Dan cuts them off. The mortar isn't supposed to hold. The mortar fills the void so water doesn't seep in and crack the stone in the frost. The supports hold. The arch holds. The geometry holds. They don't understand, but they fall silent. On the 6th day, Dan walks the length of the bridge one last time. He taps every stone. He checks the supports. He writes everything down in his notebook. The bridge stands straighter than it has in the last 20 years. The crack is sealed. The load is distributed. The decorative debris is cleared away. 10 gold pieces instead of 100. 6 days instead of waiting for the magicians who might arrive in 6 months. Holt stands on the bridge and kicks it. The bridge doesn't shake. She looks at Dan. She isn't smiling. But her eyes are different. Tomorrow we're going to Caneholm, to the king. Dan asks how far it is. 4 days on horseback. Dan says he doesn't know how to ride. She replies, "Then it will be a very long 4 days." Those 4 days on horseback turned out to be the worst 4 days of Dan's life. Worse than his structural mechanics exam in his junior year. Worse than a 15-hour shift on a construction site in Dubai. The horse hated him. He hated the horse. It was mutual. Captain Holt rode ahead and didn't look back. 4 soldiers rode with her. Dan shook in the saddle and tried not to think about the fact that he had no insurance, no medical, no... He was in a foreign world, without documents, without money, without the language, and without understanding the local laws. The only things he had were a notebook with calculations and a head that held all the courses from the engineering department at the University of Washington. At the first stop, he tried to talk to Holt. His German was terrible, but the local language was good enough for simple phrases to get across. He asked what had happened in the capital. Why did they need a builder? Holt explained briefly and without emotion. 2 years ago, the Silver Tower of Edelweiss had collapsed. The younger princess had perished, 40 courtiers. The Tower Mages Guild had declared that the runes were depleted and tripled their prices. The treasury was empty. Steppe clans were pressing in from the north. Refugees were pouring into the capital by the thousands. Nowhere to live, nothing to build with. There weren't enough mages, and those who were available demanded gold. Day listened and jotted things down in his notebook. Not Holt's words, numbers. The approximate height of the tower she described. The approximate number of floors. The approximate number of fatalities per square meter of the base. The tower didn't fall because of the runes. The tower fell because someone built a high-rise without calculating the foundation. He'd seen this before. Seen it hundreds of times in disaster reports. Turkey, Bangladesh, Florida. Buildings don't fall because of magic. Buildings fall because of greed and ignorance. On the second day of their journey, they rode through a village. Dan saw the houses and his heart sank. Not because of their beauty, because of the horror. Crooked walls, roofs of straw soaked in something black. No chimneys. Smoke billowing out through a hole in the roof. Windows without glass, patched with bull's bladder. Foundations were made of rough boulders piled haphazardly. One good spring thaw, and half these houses would slide down the hill. Dan stopped his horse and took out a notebook. He began to draw. Holt rode up and asked what he was doing. He said he was counting. She asked what? He said he was counting how many people would die in this village in the next fire. She fell silent. He fell silent too. They rode on. By the 3rd day, he began to understand the local language better. Not because he had a talent for languages, because the language of builders is universal. Stone, wood, water, wall, roof. He could talk about simple things, and they understood him. Holt started talking to him more. She told him she was the daughter of an impoverished knight, that she'd spent 10 years on the border, that she was tired of proving that a woman could be in charge. Dan said that on his construction site in Seattle, the foreman was a woman named Ruth, and she could stop a concrete mixer truck in full swing with a single glance. Holt didn't know what a concrete mixer truck was, but she appreciated the idea. On the 4th day, they left the forest and Dan saw Cainholm, the capital of Valderan. The city stood in a valley between 2 mountain ranges. The Skyscraper River cut it in half, and the first thing Dan saw were towers. Dozens of towers, slender, tall, crooked. They jutted out of the cityscape like rotten teeth. Each tower belonged to an aristocratic family. The higher the spire, the older the family. Dan looked at them and calculated. The angle of inclination, the width of the base, the ratio of height to cross-section. Not a single one of these towers would have passed a seismic safety test even by 19th century standards. They stood on magic, on prayers, not on calculations. He told Holt that half of these towers would collapse within the next 50 years. She replied that one had already collapsed. They entered the city through the north gate. The guards let them through on Holt's Pass. Dan craned his neck and looked around. The streets were narrow. The pavement was uneven. There was no sewer system. Sewage flowed through gutters along the houses. The stench was so strong it brought tears to his eyes. The wooden neighborhoods of the common folk were crammed down by the river, crowded, damp, fire hazards. Dan saw traces of a recent fire. 2 blocks had burned to the ground. Charred beams jutted out of the earth. People lived in shacks right on the ashes. He jotted it down in his notebook. Fire breaks, stone firewalls, a water pressure system. 3 words that could save hundreds of lives. But first, he had to survive himself. The royal palace stood on a hill in the center of the city. Not the tallest building, but the widest. Massive, thick walls, good masonry. Someone had built it wisely long ago. Since then, every new king had added a wing or a floor, and each addition was worse than the last. Dan saw cracks on the facade of the east wing. He saw the foundation settling at the south gate. He saw that the 3rd floor of the north addition had been added without reinforcing the lower walls. He could have written a report on the defects in 2 hours, but first he had to get through the meeting with the king. The audience took place the next morning. The throne room was long and cold. The stone walls were unfinished. Tapestries on the walls concealed cracks. Dan saw it right away. He saw that the left column was bearing more weight than the right because the floor had sagged on one side. He saw that the ceiling beams were sagging. He saw that the windows were too large for the thickness of the walls and that the masonry around them was cracking like a spider web. King Ansel IV sat on the throne, a thin man in his 50s with a gray face and tired eyes. Standing nearby was an advisor in the robes of the Tower Mages Guild. Holt introduced Dan. She said he was a foreigner, that he had repaired the bridge at the outpost without magic in 6 days for 10 gold pieces. The guild advisor immediately declared that this was impossible, that without runes, the bridge would collapse in a month. Dan took out a notebook. He opened it to the page with the bridge calculations. He walked over to the counselor and showed it to him. He asked if the counselor could see these numbers. The advisor looked and said he saw some scribbles. Dan nodded. He said that these scribbles explained why the bridge stood. He said it was called a load calculation, that each number represented weight in pounds, that each arrow indicated the direction of force, that a bridge isn't magic. A bridge is geometry and physics. The advisor smirked and said something mocking. The king raised his hand, and the advisor fell silent. Ansel looked at Dan and asked if he could repair more than just bridges. Dan said he could build anything needed. Houses, walls, fortifications, bridges, anything that stands on the ground and shouldn't fall. The king nodded. He said that right now he had one wall, the wall of the city guard barracks. It had collapsed 3 weeks ago. The guild had requested 400 gold pieces and 2 months for repairs. If the stranger could do it cheaper and faster, the king would consider it. If he couldn't, the stranger would go back to the mountains from whence he came. Dan said he wanted to see the wall. They took him to the barracks that same day. The west wall had completely collapsed, a pile of rubble. Dan examined the debris. He inspected the foundation. He inspected the remaining 3 walls. Everything became clear within 10 minutes. The foundation had settled because there was no drainage. Over the years, water had washed away the soil beneath the base. The wall hadn't fallen because it was old. The wall had fallen because it was standing in a puddle. He jotted it down in his notebook. A drainage ditch, soil compaction, a new foundation on a bed of crushed stone, a wall of hewn stone on lime mortar. No runes, no magic. 130 gold pieces, 3 weeks. He showed the estimate to the royal treasurer. The treasurer looked at the numbers, looked at Dan, looked at the numbers again, then quietly said that it was 1/3 of the guild's price. Work began the next morning. Dan stood before a pile of stones and the 10 soldiers he'd been assigned instead of laborers. The soldiers looked at him as if he were a nuisance. He looked at them as a resource. The first thing he did was divide them into 3 groups. 4 clear the rubble, 4 dig a drainage ditch, 2 cut and haul lumber for the formwork. He gave each group a simple task. He explained each task step by step. He demonstrated with his hands. He sketched it out in a notebook. The soldiers weren't builders, but they knew how to follow orders. And Dan knew how to set tasks so that even someone picking up a shovel for the first time could work. 20 years on construction sites had taught him one thing. There are no bad workers. There are bad foremen. On the third day, he ran into his first problem: stone. The local stone was strange. Half the blocks from the collapsed wall were ordinary gray sandstone. The other half glowed bluish where chipped. Enchanted stone. The same runic mortar he'd seen on the bridge. Dan picked up a block and tried to split it. The hammer bounced off. He struck harder. The hammer bounced off again. Ordinary sandstone split on the third blow. The enchanted one wouldn't give in. He made a note of it. Rune stone. Compressive strength unknown. Significantly higher than normal. Tests were needed. That was the problem. All his calculations were based on standard material properties, modulus of elasticity, tensile strength, fatigue curve. But in this world, half the materials were imbued with magic and behaved unpredictably. He couldn't just take a formula from a textbook and plug in the numbers. He needed new numbers, his own. He spent 3 evenings in the barracks conducting rudimentary tests. He loaded stones. He measured deflection with a wooden ruler. He took notes. He struck them with a hammer using varying force. He took notes. He soaked them in water. He froze them outside. He took notes. By the end of the 3rd evening, he had a table. Rough. Inaccurate. But these were his numbers for this world. He could calculate. On the 7th day of construction, an inspector from the Tower Mages Guild arrived. A fat man in a blue robe with gold embroidery. He walked around the site. He looked at the drainage ditch. He looked at the foundation. He looked at the masonry. And he declared that the construction was illegal because it was being carried out without a guild license, without a runic consecration of the site, without a magical inspection of the materials, without approval from the Council of Masters. Dan listened and nodded. Then he pulled out the scroll the king's treasurer had given him, a royal order for the work, the seal of the crown. The inspector read the scroll. His face turned red. He said this was a violation of the guild's charter and that he would file a protest. Dan said he could file whatever he wanted, but the wall would be ready in 2 weeks. The inspector left. Dan knew this was only the beginning. On the 10th day, he realized he needed help. Not muscle, a mind. Someone who understood local materials. Someone who knew how enchanted stone behaved. He asked the soldiers if they knew a stonemason, a good one, not from the guild. One of the soldiers said there was one, a woman, a former guildmaster. She'd been expelled 10 years ago. She lives in the slums by the river. She drinks. She repairs wells for food. Dan asked what her name was. Linnea asked. He found her in the basement of a dilapidated house by the riverfront, a dark room, the smell of dampness and cheap wine. A woman of about 27 sat on the floor, chiseling a stone, a small stone, about the size of a fist. She chiseled slowly and precisely. Her hands were practiced. Her strokes were even. Her masonry style was evident even on such a small piece. Dan sat down across from her and watched in silence. Linnea didn't look up. She said that if he was after the well, he should show her where it was and pay 3 copper coins. Dan asked why she'd been expelled from the guild. She fell silent. Then she said she'd suggested counting the arches by numbers. She said she'd written the formula for load distribution in a stone vault. She said she'd shown it to the masters. The masters said it was heresy, that the arches were held up by runes and the will of the gods, not numbers. They stripped her of her title and kicked her out. Dan pulled out his notebook. He opened it to a blank page. He asked her to draw her formula. Linnea looked at him. For the first time, she looked up. She looked at his helmet, at his vest, at the notebook. Then she picked up a pencil. Her hand was shaking, not from drunkenness. She drew the formula for 10 minutes. Dan watched. The formula was rough, incomplete. The symbols were unfamiliar. But the essence was correct. 10 years ago, Linnea Ask had independently derived a simplified version of the arch-span theorem, without a university, without textbooks, without a calculator, with a pencil and stones. Dan took his pencil out of his pocket and finished the formula. He added a second load component. He added the coefficient of friction between the blocks. He added the moment from the dead weight. Linnea watched his hand, the numbers, the arrows. She held her breath. Then she said quietly that she'd felt her whole life that the arch could be built better, that the numbers had to work, that stone obeys not prayers but laws, but she didn't know which ones. Dan closed his notebook. He said he needed a master craftsman, a man who understands the stone of this world, who knows how enchanted mortar and runic masonry behave, a man who isn't afraid to do the math. He asked if she would go. Linnea was silent for a minute. Then she stood up, wiped her hands, said she needed a bath and a new hammer. Dan said there wasn't a bath yet, but he'd get a bucket of water and soap. And there was a good hammer at the construction site. They returned to the barracks site. Linnea walked silently around the construction site. She touched the stones. She looked at the foundation. She looked at the drainage ditch. Then she turned to Dan and said that the drainage was correct, but the slope needed to be increased by 2 fingers because the local soil was clayey and the water drained more slowly than he thought. Dan opened his notebook. He wrote it down. She was right. The barracks wall was finished on the 18th day, 3 days ahead of schedule. 120 gold pieces instead of the 130 in the estimate. The new wall was thicker than the old one, with drainage, with a foundation on a gravel bed, with proper mortar joints. Not a single rune. The royal inspector came and inspected it. He tapped on the wall. The wall didn't shake. He kicked the foundation. The foundation didn't budge. He wrote in his report that the work was accepted. King Ansel received the report that same evening. Dan received an invitation to a second audience. This time, the throne room was fuller. Advisors, aristocrats, 2 mages from the guild in blue robes, and in the corner, standing by a column, a woman in gray, young, straight back, cold eyes, a gray dress with a high collar, mourning. Dan didn't know who she was. He found out later. Princess Elisa Valderan, the eldest princess, the sole heir since her younger sister perished under the rubble of the Silver Tower of Edelweiss 2 years ago. She stood there, staring intently at Dan. The king said he was impressed. He said the treasury had saved nearly 300 gold pieces on a single wall. Then he asked if the stranger could do anything else. Dan replied that he could. He said he had seen the city. He had seen cracks in the palace walls. He had seen the neighborhoods by the river that would burn down in the next fire. He had seen the towers that would collapse. He said he could draw up a list of urgent repairs, with prices, with deadlines, with priorities. The king looked at the mages of the guild. The mages were silent. The king told the stranger to draw up the list. Eliza in the corner didn't move, but something flickered in her eyes. For the next 2 weeks, Dan didn't build anything. He walked. Every day from dawn to dusk, he walked through Cainholm with a notebook and a tape measure. Linnea walked beside him and explained what he didn't understand. She pointed out which stone was where, which mortar, which rune, whose house, whose tower, whose territory. The city opened up before him like a patient on a surgeon's table, a sick patient. Dan started with the bridges. There were 3 bridges across the Grey Ravine in the city. The old Royal Bridge in the center, the North Bridge by the Market Square, the South Bridge by the river port. The Royal Bridge was stone and sturdy, good old masonry. Someone had built it with care long ago. The North Bridge was wooden and rotten. The South Bridge was stone but had sagged a hand's breadth on the left side, and a crack ran the entire length of the arch. Dan wrote it all down. He moved on to the walls. The city wall surrounded Cainholm in a semicircle. On the 4th side was the river. The wall was ancient, thick, but in 3 places the masonry had cracked. In one spot, the wall had tilted outward by 4 degrees. A little more, and a 50-meter-long section of the wall would fall onto the suburbs. Dan made a note of it. He moved on to the residential quarters. This was the hardest part. The wooden houses of the common folk stood so close together that you couldn't squeeze a hand between them. Not a single fire break. The chimneys were crooked. Half of them led not through the roof, but through the wall of the neighboring house. Sewage was non-existent as a concept. Sewage flowed through the streets into the river, from which people further downstream drew water to drink. Dan stood by the river, watching this, and thought that every sip of water in this city was a gamble. He made a note of it. He moved on to the aristocrats' towers. It was both fascinating and terrifying. The towers were the pride of Valderan, a symbol of the family's antiquity. The higher the spire, the greater the respect. But the towers had been built over the centuries, one after another, without a single standard. Each family hired its own mage. Each mage used his own runes. Every tower was unique, and almost every one was dangerous. Dan counted 42 towers within the city walls. Of those, he assessed 12 as critically dangerous. The tilt exceeded the permissible limit. Cracks in the load-bearing walls, settlement of the foundations. One tower, belonging to the Kesselman family, had leaned so far that the top floor hung over the street. If Dan had seen something like this in Seattle, the building would have been demolished that very day. Here, people walked beneath it every morning on their way to the market. He wrote everything down. By the end of the second week, he had a document spanning 32 pages of his notebook, a list of urgent repairs, costs, deadlines, priorities. He marked in red what needed to be done immediately: the South Bridge, a section of the city wall, the Kesselman Tower, drainage in the lower districts. In yellow, what could be postponed for 6 months: the North Bridge, repair of the palace foundation, reinforcement of the 3 middle towers. In green, what was needed for the future: fire breaks, sewer system, water supply, new housing. He presented the report to the king at the third audience. This time the hall was packed. Everyone had come. Advisors, aristocrats, the entire guild. And Eliza was standing by the column again. Dan spread the blueprints on the floor in front of the throne. He knelt down because there was no table and he needed to show the blueprints. He started with the southern bridge. He explained that the bridge had sagged due to erosion of the left support, that repairs would cost 200 gold pieces and take a month, that if it wasn't fixed, the bridge would collapse in a year and half of the southern district would lose its connection to the center. He moved on to the city wall. He pointed out the section with the slope. I explained that a buttress system was needed. I drew a buttress on the blueprint. I explained that it was a support that prevents the wall from leaning outward. The mages of the guild exchanged glances. One of them asked why a stone support was needed if a stabilization rune could be cast instead. Dan replied that a stabilization rune costs 50 gold pieces and needs to be renewed every 10 years. A buttress costs 30 gold pieces and will last 300 years without maintenance. The hall buzzed. He moved on to the Kesselman Tower. He said the tower needed to be evacuated and reinforced immediately, that the tilt was critical, that the next winter thaw could be its last. A man in an expensive doublet rose from the hall, Lord Kesselman, red with rage. He declared that his tower had stood for 200 years and would stand for another 200, that the foreigner was insulting his lineage, that this was a provocation. Dan looked at him and said calmly that the tower had stood for 200 years because it had been lucky, and luck is not a foundation. Lord Kesselman stepped toward him. Holt stepped between them, hand on her sword. The lord backed away. The king raised his hand. Silence. Anso looked at the blueprints on the floor. 32 pages. Every crack in his city, drawn and calculated. He asked how much it would all cost. Dan said that the urgent work would cost 1,500 gold. Medium-term repairs would cost 4,000. He hadn't calculated the long-term costs yet because they would require new materials and new workers. The king closed his eyes. 1,500 gold for the urgent repairs. There was less than that in the treasury. The king's advisor began to say something about priorities and the budget. Dan listened and waited. Then Eliza stepped away from the column. She walked over to the blueprints. She sat down next to Dan. She ran her finger over the drawing of the southern bridge. She asked quietly why he had drawn 2 repair options. Dan replied that the first option was more expensive but more reliable. The second was cheaper but would require repairs again in 20 years. He was offering a choice, not a solution. Eliza looked at him. For the first time in 3 meetings, he saw something other than coldness in her eyes. Interest. She stood up and told her father that the Silver Tower Edelweiss had cost 5,000 gold pieces, and renewing the runes every 10 years had cost another 1,000. And the tower had fallen, and killed her sister. The hall fell silent. Eliza said that 1,500 was less than the price of a single tower. And if a stranger could repair the entire city for the price of a single dead tower, then perhaps it was worth listening to him. The king looked at his daughter. He looked at the blueprints. He looked at Dan, who was still kneeling on the floor next to his drawings. He said one word. "Get started." Dan nodded. He gathered the blueprints. He stood up, and he went to work. The first job was the southern bridge, not because it was the most dangerous, but because everyone sees the bridge. Every day, thousands of people cross the river. If a stranger without magic repairs the bridge cheaper than the guild, the whole city will find out. Dan understood this. The king understood this. Eliza understood this better than anyone. She came to the site on the very first day, in a gray dress, with a notebook. Dan wasn't expecting it. She said she would be watching. He said she could watch from anywhere except from under the crane's boom. She asked what a crane was. He explained that it was a device for lifting heavy objects, that he was going to build the simplest crane on the shore because hauling stones by hand was a waste of time and energy. Eliza wrote down the word crane in her notebook. Dan assembled a team, 10 soldiers who worked at the barracks, Linnea as the senior stonemason, and 4 day laborers he hired for copper coins at the river port. Among the day laborers was a small, wiry woman with a sharp accent and an axe tucked into her belt. Hei Jin So, a refugee from the eastern lands, a carpenter. Dan noticed her right away. Not because she was a woman among men, but because she was the only one of the 4 who picked up the log correctly, with both hands, from below, with a straight back. The others grabbed it however they could. She knew what she was doing. Dan walked over and asked if she knew how to hew wood. She looked up at him. She was a head shorter. She said she'd been hewing since she was 6, that her grandfather built boats. Her father built houses. She would have built them too if the village hadn't been burned down. Dan nodded. He asked if she could make form work from a blueprint. She looked at the blueprint for a long time. Then she asked what those lines with numbers meant. He explained, dimensions in inches. She said she didn't know what an inch was. He pointed to the tape measure. She looked at the tape measure and her eyes widened. She asked where he'd gotten such a tape with markings. He said he'd brought it with him. She touched the tape measure with her finger. Then she said she would make the formwork. The work on the bridge was proceeding according to a plan that no one in this world had ever seen. Dan drew a chart, a long scroll with days running horizontally and tasks running vertically. Each task was marked with a bar. The bars crossed and ran parallel to one another. Some tasks could be done simultaneously, others only after the previous ones were completed. The critical path was highlighted in red. Linnea looked at the chart and quietly said that it was beautiful. Dan said it was called a Gantt chart, and that no serious construction project could do without one. Linnea asked who Gantt was. Dan said he was a good man. The first week was spent on preparation. Dan inspected the bridge in greater detail than he had the first time. He dived under the arch. He measured every stone. He drew cross-sections. The left pier had sunk because the river had washed away the soil, a classic problem. On Earth, he would have called in divers and poured a concrete cushion underwater. There were no divers here. There was no concrete. But there was a solution. Dan knew the recipe for Portland cement. Limestone and clay, fired together at high temperatures, produce clinker. Clinker ground into powder and mixed with water produces cement. Cement plus sand and gravel produces concrete. Concrete can be poured underwater if done correctly. The problem was the firing temperature. Portland cement requires 1,450 degrees. A standard furnace reaches 800. A blacksmith's forge reaches 1,000. Well, a special kiln is needed. Dan sketched a kiln for firing clinker in his notebook. He showed it to Linnea. She said that the guild had fire mages who could heat stone until it glowed white hot. That's over 1,400 degrees. Dan thought it over. This meant he needed a mage's help. One mage. Not for construction, for producing the material. This was different. He wasn't replacing magic. He was using it as a tool, like fuel for the furnace. He wrote it down. Need a fire mage. 1. For firing. Eliza came to the site every other day. She sat on a rock by the shore and watched. She took notes. Once she asked why he counted everything, why every stone was accounted for, why every worker knew their daily task, why material usage was recorded down to the last bucket of mortar. Dan said that construction was a system, that if you didn't keep track, people would steal, that if you didn't plan, deadlines would be missed, that if you didn't write things down, people would forget and repeat mistakes. Eliza was silent. Then she said quietly that when they were building the Silver Tower of Edelweiss, no one counted anything. The guild announced the amount. They received the money. It spent an unknown amount on who knows what. The tower was built. The tower fell. No one knows where the money went. Dan looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the river. He said that when the bridge was finished, he would show her the complete construction accounts. Every coin, every stone, every hour of work. She nodded without turning around. In the third week, problems with the workers began. Not with his crew, with the outsiders. 2 masons he'd hired as extras quit on the same day, without explanation. The next day, another one. Then they stopped delivering lime. The supplier said they were out of stock. Dan checked. They weren't out of stock. Someone had paid the supplier not to sell. The guild. He went to Holt. Holt cursed. She said it was to be expected. She said the guild had been controlling the supply of building materials in the capital for 200 years. One merchant tried to sell stone without the guild's seal. His shop was burned down. Dan sat on the riverbank and thought. His resources were being cut off. Without lime, there's no mortar. Without mortar, there's no masonry. Without masons, there's no work. He could complain to the king, but every complaint is politics. Every time he asks for protection, he becomes dependent. He needs a solution, a technical one. He looked at the river, at the bank, at the gravel on the bank, at the clay in the cliff. All the raw materials were right here, under his feet. He didn't need someone else's lime. He could burn his own. He stood up and began sketching in his notebook. A simple lime kiln. A pit in the ground lined with stone. Limestone loaded on top. Firewood at the bottom. A temperature of 900 degrees. Achievable without a mage. Using ordinary firewood. Lime ready in 3 days. He showed Heijin. She looked and said she could build such a kiln in 2 days if she were given people. Dan gave her 3 of them. 2 days later, the kiln stood on the shore. 5 days later, he had his own lime, cleaner and cheaper than the suppliers. Heijin stood by the kiln and looked at the white chunks of burnt stone. She said her grandfather used to make something similar for boat varnish, but not as hot. Dan said the principle was the same. Heat, chemistry, patience. She looked at him and almost smiled. Almost. When the guild found out that Dan was burning his own lime, they sent a second inspector. This one was thin and angry. He declared that the production of building materials without a guild license was prohibited by a royal decree from such and such a year. Dan asked to see the decree. The inspector said he would show it in court. Dan said he would look forward to it. The inspector left. Dan jotted down the date, the inspector's name, and his words in his notebook. Every conflict was documented. Every threat was recorded. He knew that sooner or later it would go to court, and he would be ready for court. By the end of the 2nd month, the bridge was half finished. The left pier was reinforced. The crack in the arch was patched. The scaffolding was in place. All that remained was the right side and replacing the keystone. Eliza came to the site and, for the first time, didn't stay on the shore. She walked up to the bridge. She stood next to Dan. She looked at the masonry, at the even joints, at the neat lines of mortar, at the shoring set plumb. She said she'd never seen anything like it. She said it didn't look like a construction site. It looked like the work of a watchmaker. Dan said that construction is exactly like a watchmaker's work, only the clock is big and heavy. Eliza looked at him and said she wanted to understand. She wanted to learn how to read blueprints. She wanted to know what the numbers meant. Dan was silent for a second. Then he said he'd be happy to show her. That evening, he sat in the barracks over a notebook, drawing a tutorial sketch for the princess, a simple one, with explanations. Linnea sat across from him, doing the same for the 4 day laborers who had asked her to teach them how to read his plans. Ha-Jin was sharpening an axe in the corner and pretending not to listen, but Dan could see that she was memorizing every word. He looked at these 3 women in the dim light of the oil lamp and thought, "This is it. This is the beginning." Dan began repairs on the southern bridge across the Grey Ravine and ran into sabotage by the guild, which had cut off limestone supplies and poached the masons. He solved the problem by building his own lime kiln on the riverbank with the help of Ha-Jin and the refugee carpentress. Eliza began visiting the construction site regularly and asked Dan to teach her how to read blueprints, and the team consisting of Linnea, Ha-Jin, and day laborers became the core of the future school. The southern bridge was completed in the 4th month. Dan stood on the bank and looked at it. The arch was even, the joints were neat, the left support was reinforced with a concrete foundation, the first concrete in the history of Valderon. The keystone had been replaced. The railings were new. There was drainage on both sides so that rainwater wouldn't damage the masonry. The bridge wasn't beautiful. The bridge was right. Those are 2 different things. Ha-Jin stood nearby and said nothing. She was silent when things were good. She spoke only when things were bad. Dan had already learned to read her silence. Linnea sat on the parapet and touched the stone with her palm. She stroked the masonry as if it were a living creature. She did this every time she finished a job, a habit from the guild. Eliza arrived with the treasurer. The treasurer opened the expense ledger that Dan kept, every coin, every stone, every hour. Total, 192 gold pieces. The guild had asked for 600 for this bridge. The treasurer closed the book and looked at Dan as if he had just turned lead into gold. Eliza wasn't looking at the book. She was looking at the bridge. Then she quietly asked how long it would last. Dan said that with proper maintenance, 100 years. Without maintenance, 50 years. Without runes. Without magic. Without the guild's 10-year payments. She nodded and left without saying goodbye. 3 days later, Dan learned that the people had already named the bridge, the Stranger's Bridge. He heard that name at the market while buying bread. The vendor said her husband walked across the Stranger's Bridge every day, and the bridge didn't sway. For the first time in 10 years, it didn't sway. Dan bought the bread and moved on. He didn't like the name, but you don't get to choose names. That same week, the Tower Mages Guild declared Dan a heretic, officially, with the guild's seal and a reading at City Hall. The charge stated that the stranger was engaged in construction work without the blessing of the rune masters, that his methods insulted ancient traditions, that his structures were dangerous because they lacked magical protection, that anyone who hired him or helped him was subject to excommunication from the guild's services. The last point was the most terrifying. Excommunication meant that no mage would renew the runes on your house. No guild mason would undertake repairs. You would be left alone. In a world where every 3rd building was held up by runes, this was tantamount to a death sentence for a house. People were frightened. 2 day laborers from Dan's crew left that very day. The lumber supplier canceled the contract. Even the soldiers the king had assigned began to get nervous. Dan sat in the barracks and thought. He knew this would happen. He'd read enough history to understand how monopolies fight off competitors. First, ignoring. Then, ridicule. Then, a fight. He was at the fighting stage. Holt came in that evening. She sat across from him. She laid her sword on the table. She said that 3 aristocrats had filed a complaint with the king, that the guild demanded Dan be expelled from the capital, that Master Cedric Vane had written a personal letter to the king warning that without magical protection, the Stranger's Bridge would collapse at the first heavy flood, and that the blood of the townspeople would be on the crown's hands. Dan asked when flooding usually occurred. Holt said in late spring, in 2 months. Dan nodded. He opened his notebook. He showed Holt the drainage plan he had incorporated into the bridge's design. He explained that the drainage system reduces the water pressure on the arch, that he had designed the bridge to withstand the flood load with a 30% margin of safety. that the bridge would hold. Holt looked at the drawing. She didn't understand the numbers, but she understood Dan. She had seen how he worked. She saw that every word he spoke was backed by calculations. She said she believed him. But faith won't stop the guild. Dan said he needed an ally within the guild, someone who knows magic and isn't afraid to think outside the box. Holt was silent. Then she said there was one girl, Wayne's own niece, Mirabelle. She'd been seen in the library at night. She was looking for something, about runes and numbers. Dan asked her to set up a meeting. The meeting took place 4 days later at a tavern near the market square. Mirabelle Vane turned out to be a 19-year-old girl with ink stains on her fingers and tired eyes. She came in a simple dress without any guild insignia. She sat down across from Dan. She was silent for a minute. Then she said she had come because she had seen his drawings. One of the guild inspectors had brought a copy as evidence of heresy. Mirabelle saw something in the drawing that no one else had seen. She saw that the load lines in Dan's drawing coincided with the lines of the rune field, that his calculations described the same forces that intuitively sense when they place stabilization runes, only he had it written down in numbers. For mages, it was a sensation in their fingertips. Dan listened and, for the first time in 4 months in this world, felt goosebumps run down his spine. If she's right, then magic and physics in this world don't contradict each other. They describe the same thing in different languages. Stabilization runes work because they redirect the load in exactly the same way as his buttresses and struts. Only magicians do it intuitively, while he does it by calculation. And if you combine both approaches, you can build things that neither magic alone nor engineering alone. He asked Mirabelle if she saw runes as a structure. She said yes, that she always had, that in the guild they considered it strange. Mages sense runes as heat or pressure. She saw them as lines, as a grid, as a framework. Her uncle believed that this made her the ideal mage architect. She thought it made her a magic accountant, because all they ever wanted her to do was check other people's runes for mistakes. Dan took out a notebook. He drew a simple arch. He drew load-bearing lines. He asked Mirabelle to draw a rune grid next to it, the kind a mage would place on such an arch. She took a pencil and drew it. Dan watched. The lines almost matched. Almost, but not completely. There was a discrepancy at 2 points. He asked what was happening at those points. Mirabelle said that the runes were reinforced there because mages sense those as weak spots. Dan pointed to his calculation. Those points showed maximum stress. The mages sensed what he had calculated. They both fell silent. Mirabelle looked at the superimposed drawing, and her hands were trembling. She said that if her uncle found out she was here, they'd lock her up in the guild tower. Dan said he wouldn't force her, that the choice was hers. She looked at the drawing for another minute. Then she said she had made her choice long ago, that she had chosen the moment she saw his lines on paper and realized she wasn't crazy, that the numbers worked, that runes weren't a prayer, that everything could be calculated. She left the tavern quietly. 3 days later, she left the guild. The scandal was deafening. Master Wayne announced that his niece had gone mad under the influence of a heretic, that this proved the danger of the stranger, that he was corrupting young mages. Mirabelle arrived at the construction site with a bag of books and a rune tablet. She stood before Dan and said she was ready to work. Dan looked at her ink-stained fingers, at the bag of books, at the tablet. He asked how she would connect 2 stabilization runes at the joint between stone blocks. Mirabelle began to explain the guild's standard method. Dan stopped her. He said he wasn't asking how they were taught. He was asking how she would do it. Mirabelle fell silent. Then she said there had to be a gap between the runes, 3 millimeters, because the runes expand when activated, and if they're touching, they interfere with each other. Dan wrote it down. 3 millimeters. An expansion joint for the runes, just like an expansion joint in concrete. He looked at Mirabelle and said, "Welcome to the team." It was the 6th month. Dan stood on a hill outside the city and looked north. Somewhere over there, Beyond the ridge, a war was raging. The steppe clans were pressing against the border. Refugees were streaming into Cainholm by the thousands. Every week, a new camp of rags and sticks sprang up at the northern gate. People had nowhere to live. Cainholm was suffocating. Dan saw the camp every day on his way to the construction site. Children in the mud, old people under the open sky, women boiling river water in cauldrons, hoping it would be enough to keep them from getting sick. It wasn't enough. Disease crept through the camp slowly and unstoppably. Dan knew what needed to be done. He'd known it from the first day he saw that camp. But he didn't have the resources. He didn't have the people. He didn't have permission. Now, after the bridge, he had all three. He went to Eliza with the blueprint, not to the king, to her, because over the past 4 months he had realized one thing. The king made the decisions. Eliza prepared them. She was sitting in her office on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, a small room, a desk piled high with papers. On the wall, a map of the kingdom with pins marking the positions of the steppe clans. She looked up when he entered. She wasn't surprised, as if she'd been waiting. Dan spread the blueprint out on her desk on top of the papers. A residential neighborhood. Not a palace, not a tower, a neighborhood. 20 houses, each for 4 families. Stone walls, wooden floors, 2 stories, tile roofs, stove heating with pipes running through the rooms. The chimneys are properly vented. Windows. Outhouses on every floor with cesspools located outside the block. Fire breaks between the houses, 2 buildings wide. A well in the center of the block with a stone rim and a lid. Eliza looked at the blueprint for a long time. Then she asked who it was for. Dan said for refugees. She asked how many. Dan said 1,000 gold pieces for the entire block, 5 gold pieces per spot for 1 family. She looked up at him. She asked if he was joking. The Silver Tower Edelweiss cost 5,000, and only 1 family lived there. He was proposing to house 80 families for 1,000. Dan said he wasn't joking. He said that a tower is a luxury, a house is a necessity. Luxury is expensive because it is useless. A necessity is cheap because it is rational. Eliza was silent. Then she stood up. She rolled up the blueprint. She said she was going to her father. 2 days later, Dan received a royal order to build a residential neighborhood for refugees on the vacant lot by the North Gate. 1,000 gold pieces from the war fund. It was politics. Dan understood that. The king was building housing for refugees not because he loved refugees, but because homeless refugees mean a riot. And a riot in the rear when there's a war at the border means the end. Dan didn't care why. The main thing was that they'd been given permission to build. He assembled a team. Linnea, Hajin, Mirabel, 10 soldiers, and for the first time, 20 volunteers from among the refugees themselves, people he'd promised housing to. They weren't builders, but they were motivated. They were building their own home. Dan divided the construction site into sections. Each house was a separate section. Each section was assigned to a 5-person crew. The foreman received the blueprint and the daily task. Linnea supervised the masonry. Hajin supervised the carpentry. Mirabel places minimal runes on the foundations. Not for beauty, and not for tradition, for waterproofing. Dan discovered that the water-repelling rune worked better than any waterproofing he knew of. Mirabel could cast such a rune in an hour, and it cost 2 gold pieces instead of 20 for bitumen treatment, a substance that didn't even exist in this world. It was the first true union of magic and engineering, not one replacing the other, integration. The rune did what it did best. Engineering did the rest. Mirabel worked and glowed, not with magic, with happiness. For the first time in her life, she was asked what she thought. For the first time, her runes were part of a system, not a patch on someone else's work. Construction was moving faster than Dan had expected. The refugees worked furiously. They hauled stones at a run. They mixed mortar without stopping. Mothers came to the site with babies on their backs and laid bricks with one hand. Dan saw this and his throat tightened. He remembered the workers in Dubai, migrants from Bangladesh and Nepal. They, too, built other people's homes, but for themselves they had nothing. Here it was different. Here they were building for themselves. A month later, the walls of the first 4 houses were up. A month and a half later, the roofs. Jin built a roof truss system that Dan was proud of. Simple, sturdy, with the right roof pitch for the local climate. She calculated the angle herself, without formulas, based on the experience of 3 generations of carpenters. Dan checked her calculation using his own methods. The difference was 2 degrees. He told her about it. She said that 2 degrees was nothing. He said that 2 degrees meant 2,000 liters of snow on the roof that might or might not slide off. She fell silent. Then she adjusted the angle. Later that evening, she approached him and asked him to show her how he calculated it. He showed her. She listened and nodded. Then she said that her grandfather calculated the same way, only he didn't write it down. He kept it in his head. So when he died, his knowledge died with him. She said she would write down everything she knew. Dan gave her a notebook. In the 8th week of construction, Eliza arrived, not alone. With her was a man in an expensive dark coat, a gaunt face, gray temples, piercing eyes. Master Cedric Wayne, head of the Tower Mages Guild, Mirabelle's uncle. Dan was standing waist-deep in the foundation pit of the 5th house, dirty, wet, wearing an orange hard hat that had long since lost its orange color and turned brown. Vane stopped at the edge of the site and surveyed the construction, long and carefully. Then he looked at Mirabelle, who was placing a rune on the foundation of the nearest house. Mirabelle froze. She turned pale. But she didn't leave. She remained standing with the rune tablet in her hands. Wayne didn't speak to her. He turned to Dan, said he'd come to see what the outsider was up to, said that 20 houses without full rune protection meant 20 funerals at the first earthquake. Dan climbed out of the excavation pit, brushed himself off. He took out a notebook. He opened it to the page with the seismic load calculation. He showed it to Wayne. He explained that a 2-story building with a proper foundation and a wooden frame can withstand an earthquake of up to 6 on the Richter scale without any magic, that the wooden frame is flexible and absorbs vibrations, that the stone walls are infill, not load-bearing, that the frame bears the load. Wayne listened in silence. Then he said that a magnitude 6 was a typical morning in the mountains, that a real earthquake was a magnitude 8, and he asked if a house without runes could withstand an 8. Dan said honestly that it couldn't, that for an 8 you'd need either steel reinforcement, which he didn't have enough of, or rune reinforcement at the structural joints. And that's exactly why Mirabelle places runes on the foundations. Not everywhere, only where they're needed. Wayne looked at the tribe, then at Dan, then at the houses. Then he said it was heresy anyway, and he left. Eliza stayed. She stood next to Dan and watched as Wayne walked down the road toward the city. Then she said that Wayne wouldn't have come if he weren't afraid, that he came because he saw that Dan was right, and that's what scares him the most. Dan received a contract to build a residential neighborhood for refugees and, for the first time, integrated Mirabelle's magic into the engineering design, using water-repelling runes to waterproof the foundations. Master Wayne personally visited the construction site and saw the work, but called it all heresy. Jin began writing down her family's carpentry knowledge in a notebook, following Dan's example. The refugee neighborhood was completed in 9 months, 20 houses, 80 families, 312 people. Dan knew the exact number because Eliza kept the lists. She came on opening day, not in gray, in dark blue. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't in mourning. Dan noticed but said nothing. The king gave a speech that Dan didn't listen to because he was standing on the roof of the 5th house, checking the tiles. Jin stood nearby and helped. Linnea was downstairs, showing the new residents how the heating system worked. Mirabelle was checking the runes. Holt stood at the neighborhood gate and kept order. Everything was working. The stoves were heating, the roofs weren't leaking, the walls stood straight, the doors closed, the windows let in light. Simple things, basic, but for the 312 people who had been living in ragged tents for the past 6 months, it was a miracle. An elderly refugee woman entered her room on the 2nd floor, a small room, 4 walls, a window, a stove in the corner, a wooden floor. She stood in the middle and cried, not out of grief. Dan saw it from the hallway. He turned away and went up to the roof. It was easier to breathe there. That evening, Eliza found him at the construction site. He was sitting on the steps of the first house, writing in a notebook. She sat down next to him. They were silent. Then she said she wanted to show him something. She asked him to come to the Royal Library tomorrow. Dan came. The library occupied the basement of the palace's west wing. Long corridors, stone shelves, thousands of scrolls and books. It smelled of dust and old leather. Eliza was waiting by the far wall. She was holding an old scroll, a very old one. The leather was cracked. The ink had faded. She unfolded it on the table. Dan looked at it and froze. There was a drawing on the scroll, an arched bridge, with load calculations, with a moment diagram, with a cross-section of the support. The symbols were different, the language was different, but the math was the same, exactly the same. In the lower right corner was a signature, Master Alaric, and a date, 322 years ago. Dan sat down on a chair because his legs had given out. Eliza said she had found this scroll a month ago while searching for old documents on the construction of the Silver Tower. She said the scroll had been lying in a sealed box marked "Do Not Open" by order of the guild. She had opened it. Dan looked at the drawing and his hands were shaking. 300 years ago, someone had drawn exactly as he did. The same load arrows, the same calculation method, and the note in the corner. Portland mortar, a 1-to-3 ratio. Portland cement. 300 years ago. Someone had been here before him. Someone already knew everything he knows. And that someone was burned for heresy. Eliza said that Alaric was burned by the guild 300 years ago, accused of practicing witchcraft without a license, of desecrating building traditions, of heresy against the runic order. His drawings were sealed, his works destroyed, his name struck from the register of masters. Dan asked if there were others. Eliza said she didn't know, but that in the same box lay a note in a language she didn't know. She handed him a yellowed scrap of paper. Dan took it and read it. The note was in English, in modern English, in the crooked handwriting of a man in a hurry. It read as follows. If you're reading this, it means you're just like me. Don't trust the guild. They know. They've always known. Run or hide. I didn't make it. Dan put the note on the table. He looked at Eliza. She was looking at him and waiting. He said it was written in his language, in the language of his world, that Alaric was just like him, that someone in the guild knows that people like him are appearing and is destroying them, systematically, for 300 years. Eliza didn't look surprised. She said she'd suspected it from the moment she read the indictment against Alaric. Too fast, too organized, as if they already had a plan ready for such a case. Dan asked if Wayne knew. Eliza said she didn't know. Wayne is old, but not that old. 300 years isn't a human lifespan. Someone else. Someone behind the scenes. Or something. Dan put the note in his pocket. He tucked Alaric's sketch into his notebook. He looked at Eliza and said that now he definitely wouldn't leave. That someone 300 years ago had tried to do what he was doing, and they'd been killed. And everything they knew died with them. 300 years of lost progress. 300 years of houses burning and towers falling. 300 years of people hauling water from the river and dying from diseases that could be prevented by a sewer system. He wouldn't let that happen again. Eliza looked at him. Then she said quietly that her sister's name was Katerina, that she was 17, that she loved to draw birds, that on that day she had climbed to the top floor of the Silver Tower because from there you could see the swallows' nests under the eaves. And then the tower fell. Dan was silent. Eliza said that for 2 years she had thought it was the will of the gods. That's what everyone said. That the tower fell because the runes had run out. That no one was to blame. And then a stranger came with a notebook and a tape measure and, in 2 hours, calculated that the tower had been doomed from the moment the foundation was laid. That it wasn't the gods. That it was a mistake. That her sister didn't die because of fate, but because of someone's incompetence. She fell silent. Dan was silent too. Then he said that if she wanted, he could design a grave for Katerina. Not a tower, not a monument, a place. A place she'd want to visit. Eliza looked at him. Her eyes were shining, but she wasn't crying. She nodded. She didn't say a word. They left the library in silence. It was snowing outside. The first snow of this winter. Dan looked up at the sky and thought that this was the second time in his life he'd stood in the snow in this world. The first time, he'd been alone with two halberds at his throat. Now, standing beside him was a princess who had entrusted him with the memory of her sister. Something had changed. The refugee quarter was open, and 312 people had been given housing. Eliza showed Dan the old blueprints of Master Alaric, who 300 years ago had used the same engineering methods and had been burned at the stake by the guild. Alaric's note in English confirmed that someone in the guild was systematically eliminating travelers from another world. Eliza told Dan about the death of her sister Katerina and asked him to design a headstone for her. The first assassination attempt took place at the end of the 9th month. Dan was working the night shift, reinforcing a section of the city wall. That very section with a 4-degree slope. The buttresses were almost finished. 3 massive stone buttresses braced against the wall from the outside, preventing it from collapsing further. A simple solution, an ancient one. Gothic cathedrals in Europe had stood on such buttresses for centuries. He was inspecting the masonry of the upper tier when he heard a sound. A quiet creak. Wood against wood. He had worked on scaffolding and knew how scaffolding creaked when someone climbed on it. This creak was different. It was the creak of a sawed-through beam. He froze. He looked down. It was dark. The oil lantern illuminated a spot 3 meters wide. Nothing was visible beyond the light. He slowly crouched down. He felt the beam beneath his feet. His left hand found a cut in the wood. Deep. Almost all the way through. Someone had sawed through a support beam of the scaffolding at the height of the 4th level. If he took 2 more steps forward, the beam would break and he would fall from a height of 12 meters onto the rocks. Dan froze. His heart was pounding. His hands were sweaty. He was standing on the sawed-through scaffolding in the dark at the height of the 4th floor. Alone. Slowly, very slowly, he dropped to his knees. He lay down on the planks, distributed his weight, crawled backward, toward the stairwell. The planks creaked but held. He reached the stairs and climbed down. It was dark and quiet below. No one was there. Whoever had sawed through the beam was long gone, did the job, and vanished into the night. A professional. Dan sat down on a rock at the base of the scaffolding and breathed. Just breathed. 3 minutes. Then he took out his notebook, jotted down the date, the time, the location of the cut, the depth, the type of tool, judging by the marks, a fine-toothed saw, not a carpenter's, more like a jeweler's. Someone meticulous and patient. In the morning, he showed Holt the sawed-through beam. Holt turned pale. Then she flushed. Then she cursed so loudly that 2 soldiers turned away. She said she'd post guards at every construction site. Dan said guards were good, but there was something better. He showed her a second beam, parallel to the sawed-off one, a steel core inside. He'd installed it during the very first week of work on this site, because he knew. He knew from the very beginning that someone would try to cut the scaffolding. It's a classic, the easiest way to stage an accident on a construction site, to make something fall. He's an engineer. He always builds in a margin of safety. Holt looked at the steel core, then at Dan. Then she said he was crazy. He replied that he wasn't. He's paranoid. Those are 2 different. A paranoid person survives. The investigation turned up nothing. No witnesses, no traces. The saw was not found. Holt questioned everyone who had been at the construction site that evening. Nothing. Dan wasn't surprised. He recorded the incident in his journal, in detail, with drawings, with photographs he couldn't take because he didn't have a camera, but with precise sketches of the scene and the traces. This log would become important later, in court. He didn't know that yet, but he sensed it. A week after the assassination attempt, he received an unexpected visitor, Sora Pack. the 17-year-old daughter of a baker from the capital. She came to the construction site by the city wall and stood off to the side for 3 hours, watching. In the 4th hour, Linnea noticed her and asked what she wanted. Sora said she wanted to learn. Linnea brought her to Dan. Small, slender, hands covered in flour, eyes huge and frightened. Dan asked what she could do. Sora said nothing. Then she paused and said she could count. Dan asked what she meant. Sora pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of her pocket. On the paper was a formula. The area of an irregular quadrilateral. She had derived it herself, without a textbook, without a teacher, because she was bored behind the bakery counter and she had calculated the area of the counter, which was crooked. Dan looked at the formula. The formula was correct. Not elegant, not standard, but correct. This girl, all by herself, had arrived at the result that mathematicians had been working toward for centuries. He looked at her and asked if she wanted to learn to build. She said yes. He asked what her father would say. She fell silent. Then she said that her father believed construction wasn't for girls, that girls should bake bread, get married, have children. Dan nodded. He said he would talk to her father. Sora said her father wouldn't listen. Dan said he would. He went to the bakery that same evening. The baker was a heavy-set man with a red face and strong hands. Dan bought some bread. He tasted it. Good bread. He said so. The baker nodded warily. Dan said his daughter had come to the construction site, that she was talented, that he wanted to take her on as an apprentice. The baker blushed even more. He said his daughter wouldn't be hauling bricks, that he hadn't raised her for that a construction site was dirty and dangerous and no place for a girl. Dan said he wasn't suggesting she haul bricks, that she didn't need to haul bricks, that she needs a pencil and paper, that she draws better than any of his workers, that she could become a draftsman, a designer, that it's clean work, intellectual work, that she would draw houses where people would live. The baker was silent. Then he said he didn't trust a stranger. Dan said he wasn't asking him to trust him. He was asking him to give his daughter a month. If in a month she wanted to go back to the bakery, no one would stop her. The baker was silent for a long time. Then he waved his hand. He said a month, no more. Dan nodded and left. Sora was waiting around the corner. She had heard everything. Her eyes were red. Dan said she had a month, not to waste it. She nodded and ran. By the 11th month, Dan no longer had just a team. He had a core, 6 people. Linnea, who knew stone, Heijin, who knew wood, Mirabel, who knew runes, Holt, who knew swords and politics, Sora, who knew numbers, and Eliza, who knew everything else. Every evening they gathered around the table in the barracks. Dan laid out the blueprints. Linnea complained about the quality of the local mortar. Heijin silently corrected the roof truss diagram. Mirabel drew rune grids over the engineering schematics. Sora recalculated areas and volumes and every time found an error that everyone else had missed. Holt drank tea and told stories about which aristocrat had complained about the construction noise that week. Eliza arrived last of all. She sat in the corner. She listened. She took notes. Sometimes she asked a question that made everyone fall silent because the question was the right one. Dan looked at them and thought that this was no longer a crew. It was a seed. The seeds of something greater. The first attempt on Dan's life took place. Someone had sawed through a support beam of the scaffolding, but Dan survived thanks to a steel core he had installed in advance as a precaution. Sora Pak, the 17-year-old daughter of a baker who had independently derived the formula for the area of an irregular quadrilateral, joined the team. By the 11th month, a core of 6 people had formed around Dan. A core group of 6 people had formed, which became the foundation of the future school. The idea for the school wasn't born at a desk or over blueprints. It was born in a fire. At the beginning of the 12th month, a wooden neighborhood near the western gate caught fire. At night. A chimney pipe protruding through the wall of a neighboring house. A spark. Dry wood. Wind. An hour later, 16 houses were burning. 2.5 hours later. Dan stood at the edge of the fire and watched. There was nothing to be done. There wasn't enough water. There were no fire departments. People carried buckets from the river in a chain, and that was enough to save the neighboring blocks, but not the ones already burning. 30 houses, 120 families, 8 dead. Dan stood there and counted. Not money, people. 8 people died because their houses were built wrong, because the chimney went through someone else's wall, because there was no gap between the houses, because the roofs were made of straw, because no one had ever taught the local builders that things could be built differently. The next morning he went to see Eliza, covered in soot, sleepless. She hadn't slept either. She had been at the fire too. Dan said he needed a school, not a guild, a school, open to everyone, from masons and carpenters and common folk and women and refugees. A place where they teach how to build properly, where they teach math, where they teach that you can't run a chimney through someone else's wall, that there needs to be a gap between houses, that you can roof with tiles that don't burn, that the foundation needs to be set on a bed of gravel. Simple things, obvious things, but someone has to explain them. Eliza listened. Then she asked what he would name the school. Dan said he didn't know. Eliza said that a school without a name was just a shed with a sign. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said, Cross School, his last name, because he had nothing else. No family, no title, no land, just a name and knowledge. Eliza nodded. She said she'd talk to her father. A week later, a royal decree allocated an old arsenal building near the city's northern wall for the school. Stone, 2 stories, abandoned. The roof had caved in. The walls were intact. The foundation was solid. Dan inspected it and said he'd have it fixed up in a month. He got it done in 3 weeks. Heijin built a new roof. Linnea restored the masonry. Mirabelle placed waterproofing runes on the foundation and a heating rune on the furnace, which doubled its efficiency. Sora drew up a seating plan and calculated how many students would fit in each room. 20 on the first floor, 15 on the second, plus the workshop in the courtyard. The first intake was 20 students. Dan selected them personally, not by birth, not by money, by their hands and their eyes. He gave each candidate a stone and asked them to chip one side flat. Not perfectly, just flat. Those who tried to do it quickly were weeded out. Those who tried to make it beautiful were weeded out. Those who tried to make it even remained. Of the 20 students, 10 were commoners, 7 were women, 3 were refugees. Not a single aristocrat, not a single mage. The scandal in the city was huge. The guild declared the school illegal. 3 aristocratic houses lodged a protest with the king. The Council of Masters wrote an official letter stating that teaching construction without a rune license was a threat to the kingdom's security. The king remained silent. That meant consent. Eliza explained this subtlety. In Valderon, silence from the crown does not mean neutrality. It means quiet support. If the king were against it, he would have said no. If he remains silent, it means he wants the school to operate, but doesn't want to say so out loud, because then he would have to openly clash with the guild. Dan understood. Politics. He taught the first lesson himself, standing at the blackboard, with chalk, wearing a hard hat. Linnea later said he looked ridiculous. He said the hard hat was a symbol. On a construction site, a hard hat means you work here. At school, a hard hat means you're here learning to build. Every student will get a hard hat. Linnea said there aren't that many hard hats in the kingdom. Dan said there would be. The first lesson was about foundations, not about formulas, not about calculations, about the ground. Dan took a handful of clay and a handful of sand. He put the clay on the table. He placed a stone on it. The stone sank. He put down the sand. He placed the stone stood. That's the whole foundation. The base must be firm and dry. Clay gets wet and shifts. Sand is dry and holds. Gravel is even better. 20 pairs of eyes were watching him. Then one of the students, a guy in his 20s, the blacksmith's son, asked, "What about the runes? Don't you need to consecrate the foundation with stabilization runes?" Dan said that runes are a tool. like a hammer. A hammer is useful when you need it, but you shouldn't hammer every nail when you can screw in a screw. The apprentice didn't understand. Mirabelle, who was sitting in the back row, stood up and explained it in her own way. She said that a stabilization rune is like lending a shoulder to a friend who is staggering. It helps, but it's better if the friend isn't staggering in the first place. If the foundation is sound, the rune isn't needed. If the foundation is weak, the rune is a crutch, and you won't get very far on crutches. The 20 students fell silent. Then the same boy nodded and said he understood. Dan looked at Mirabelle. She was standing by the wall with a rune tablet in her hands, smiling slightly. She had found her own language. Not runic, not engineering, her own. The school was up and running. Every day from dawn until noon, theory. From noon until sunset, practice. The students built, simple things at first, a single row wall, a double row wall, bonding the masonry. Then more complex things, an arch. Linnea taught the arch. She stood before 20 students and explained her formula, the very one for which she had been expelled from the guild 10 years ago. Her voice trembled when she began. By the middle of the lesson, her voice had steadied. By the end, she was speaking loudly and confidently, drawing on the board so fast that the chalk crumbled. Dan stood in the doorway and watched. Then he went to his room. He took Linnea's drawing, that old, ridiculed drawing of an arch she'd sketched in the slums. He put it in a frame. He hung it on the school wall by the entrance. He nailed a plaque beneath the frame. The first correct calculation in the history of Valderon, by Master Linnea Ask. Linnea saw the plaque that evening. She stopped. She stood there for a minute, too. Dan watched from the second-floor window. She wasn't crying. She just stood there looking at her name on the wall. For 10 years, people had told her she was crazy, that numbers didn't work, that the arches were held up by prayers. Now her name hung on the school wall, and 20 students walked past that plaque every day, knowing that numbers worked, that they had always worked. A week after the school opened, Wayne came, again, this time alone, without Eliza, without his entourage, an old man in a dark coat. He stood at the school gate and looked at Linnea's plaque. Dan went out to him. They stood side by side in silence. Then Wayne said that 30 years ago, a young master named Linnea Ask had brought him a blueprint. He looked at it and sent her away. Not because the blueprint was bad, but because if the blueprint was correct, then everything the guild stood for was wrong. And he couldn't let that happen. Dan said nothing. Wayne said he hadn't come to make peace. He'd come to warn him. He said there were people in the guild he didn't control. Old ones, powerful ones. Those who remembered Alaric. Not personally, of course, but they remembered what happened and what was done to him. And they were ready to do it again. Dan asked who. Wayne shook his head. He said he didn't know their names. He only knew that there was a sealed section in the guild's archives to which he, as a master, had no access. That the seal on it was older than the guild itself. That he had once tried to break it open and found a note on his desk the next morning. One word. Remember. Wayne said that and left. He didn't look back. Dan stood at the school gate and watched him go. Then he took out a notebook. He wrote everything down. The sealed section. The seal, older than the guild. The note. Remember. Someone behind the scenes. Someone with a very long memory. After a major fire that destroyed 30 houses, Dan founded Cross School in an abandoned arsenal building. The first class consisted of 20 students, half of whom were commoners and a third of whom were women. Linnea began teaching arch calculation, and Dan hung her old drawing on the school wall with a label. Master Wayne came with a warning that there was a secret power within the guild older than the guild itself, one that had already destroyed intruders and could do so again. A year and a half, 18 months, in a world that Dan still didn't fully understand. But the world was beginning to understand him. Cross's school was open every day. 20 students became 25, then 30. People came on their own, Not just from the capital, from the villages, from the coast, even from the south, where rumors were already circulating about a stranger in an orange hard hat. Dan couldn't accept everyone. There wasn't enough space. There weren't enough teachers. He himself wasn't enough. He was torn between the school and the construction sites. The buttresses on the city wall were finished. The South Bridge stood. The refugee quarter was thriving. Now the king wanted more. The northern bridge across the Grey Ravine, the main bridge, the one that connected the capital to the northern provinces, from which caravans carrying grain and iron set out. The wooden bridge had been rotting for 20 years. Every spring it was patched up, every fall it sagged. Carts passed one at a time, and the bridge groaned under each one. Dan looked at it and saw a corpse. Not a bridge, but a memory of a bridge. There was no point in repairing it. A new one was needed. A stone one, an arched one, with the correct calculation of the span, with drainage, with supports on a rock foundation, a bridge that would stand for 200 years. He drew it for 3 weeks, at night, by candlelight. Linnea sat across from him and calculated with him, 2 heads over a single drawing. They argued about the thickness of the arch. He said 40 centimeters. She said 50 because the local stone was softer than the kind he was used to. He checked. She was right. Again. He corrected the calculation and looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the drawing, at the lines, at the numbers, at the arch that was their shared child. Then she looked up and saw that he was watching her. She didn't look away. They were silent. Heijin came in with tea. She set down 2 mugs. She looked at them. She looked at the drawing. She said that the truss system for the access ramp was too light for winter loads and that she had already recalculated it, and here was her version. She placed the sheet of paper on top of the drawing and left. Dan looked at her calculation. Correct. Linnea smiled and said that Heijin was silent but saw everything. Construction of the northern bridge began in the middle of the 2nd year. It was Dan's biggest project in this world. A span of 60 meters, 3 arches, 2 intermediate supports in the riverbed. The supports required an underwater foundation. The underwater foundation required concrete. Real concrete. Portland cement. Dan spent 2 months building a kiln for firing clinker. Mirabel found a fire mage, an old man from the guild, a renegade. A quiet man who loved fire more than politics. For 10 gold pieces a week, he heated the kiln to 1,500 degrees and asked no questions. The first batch of clinker turned out poorly. Too much clay. Dan adjusted the proportions. The second batch was better. The third was good. He ground the clinker in a stone mill, mixed it with water, got a gray mass. After a day, it hardened. He struck it with a hammer. The sound was right, ringing, solid, concrete. The first concrete in this world, made according to a recipe from a textbook that Dan knew by heart. Linnea touched the concrete cube and said it was stronger than runic mortar. Mirabel checked. She confirmed it. The compressive strength was 40% higher, without a single rune. Dan stood in front of the concrete cube and thought about how, 300 years ago, Alaric had written in his drawings about Portland cement with a 1-to-3 ratio. Alaric knew. Alaric had tried, and they burned him. Now concrete existed again, and this time they wouldn't burn it. Work on the bridge was going slowly. The river was fast and cold. Setting supports in the riverbed meant working waist-deep in icy water. Dan had designed a caisson, a wooden box with no bottom, lowered into the water. Inside, they bailed out the water with buckets. At the bottom, they poured concrete. Simple in theory, a nightmare in practice. Water seeped in. The caisson was being twisted by the current. The workers were freezing. Heijin spent so many hours in the water that the skin on her hands cracked and bled. Dan told her to get out. She said she would get out when the caisson was level. He said it was an order. She looked at him. Then she climbed out, silently. That evening, he came to her barracks. He brought an ointment that Mirabel had brewed from herbs and a drop of runic energy. Heijin sat on her bunk and stared at her hands. He sat down next to her. He took her hands. He rubbed the ointment on them. She didn't pull them away. They were silent. He said he would build her a house, a real one, with low doorways because she's small, with a wide windowsill facing east because she wakes up at dawn, with a place for her father's grave in the yard. She pulled her hands away. She stood up. She turned away. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that everything she gets attached to burns down. The village burned down. Her family burned down. If she gets attached to this place, it will burn down too. Dan said he was an engineer, that he built things that didn't burn. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders trembled. The bridge grew, slowly, stone by stone, arch by arch. By the end of the 3rd month of construction, the first arch was complete. Dan took out the compass, and the arch stood on its own. The workers froze. Linnea stood below and looked up. The arch stood, without runes, without magic, based on calculations, based on geometry, on the numbers she had once scribbled on a scrap of paper in the slums. The crowd on the bank watched in silence. Then someone clapped. Then another. Then the bank buzzed with excitement. Dan stood on the arch and didn't hear them. He was listening to the stone. The stone was silent. That meant everything was right. Dan began construction of a new stone bridge across the gray wreck. He set up Portland's cement production with the help of a fire mage and Mirabelle and obtained the first real concrete in the history of the world. Hei Jin worked on the caissons in the icy water, and Dan promised to build her a house. The first arch of the bridge was completed without magic, relying solely on calculations and Linnea's figures. The bridge was finished in the 6th month of construction, midway through Dan's 2nd year in Valderan. 3 arches, 60 meters, stone, concrete piers in the riverbed, drainage, railings, access ramps with wooden decking on stone piers. The bridge was not merely sturdy, the bridge was beautiful. Not merely decorative, proportional. Dan knew that a correct structure is always beautiful, that an arch calculated with precision looks lighter than one built by eye, that when every stone is in its place and bears its share of the load, the whole structure looks as if it's suspended in the air. The people gave it a second name, the Great Stranger's Bridge. The first became the Little Stranger's Bridge. Dan still didn't like that name, but he'd gotten used to it. The opening was a grand affair. The king came in person. He rode across the bridge on horseback. The bridge didn't budge. A regiment of the guard rode past behind the king. The bridge didn't budge. 3 loaded carts passed behind the regiment at the same time. The bridge didn't budge. The crowd on the banks cheered. Dan stood to the side and watched. His team stood nearby. Linnea, her hands covered in stone dust. Ha-Jin, a hammer tucked into her belt. Mirabelle, holding a rune tablet. Sora, with a notebook containing the complete calculations for the 3rd arch. Her calculations. Dan had checked them and found no errors. She was 17, and she had calculated the bridge arch that the king had just driven. Holt stood slightly behind them, her hand on her sword. She always stood that way, between Dan and the world. Eliza hadn't come to the opening. She was waiting for him in the library. When he arrived that evening, she was sitting at a table in front of 2 scrolls. One was old, Alaric's blueprint. The second was new. She had found it that morning, in another sealed box, deeper in the library's basement. Dan unrolled the scroll. It wasn't a blueprint. It was a list. Names, dates. 15 names over 300 years. Next to each name, a manner of death. Burned, drowned, fell from a tower, poisoned, disappeared, killed while attempting to escape, executed for heresy. 15 people, 15 time travelers, over 300 years. Alaric was first on the list. The last one was 80 years ago. Name, Victor. Cause of death, executed for heresy. Dan placed the list on the table. His hands didn't tremble. He didn't let them tremble. He looked at Eliza. She was looking at him. He said that 15 people had tried to do what he was doing. All of them died. Someone finds them and kills them, systematically, like a protocol, like a procedure. Eliza said she'd noticed one detail. the time between appearances. It's irregular, sometimes 20 years, sometimes 50, sometimes 10. But after each death, at least 15 years pass before the next appearance, as if someone closes the passage after each time. And the passage opens again only after a while. Dan remembered. The sign Marcus found at the construction site in San Francisco. A beacon. Alaric left a beacon so that someone could come for him, or so that he could return. The beacon worked for 300 years. It drew people from another world, and someone in the guild knew about it and waited for each newcomer. He put the list in his pocket, told Eliza he needed to go to the guild archives, to the sealed section Wayne had mentioned. Eliza said it was impossible, that the guild was a fortress, that no one but members is allowed inside. Dan said he had a guild member, a former one, Mirabelle. Eliza shook her head. She said Mirabelle had been stripped of her access. Dan said that access and knowing where things are two different things. He didn't need access. He needed a map. He spoke with Mirabelle that very night. She turned pale when she saw the list. 15 names. 15 deaths. Then she said she knew about the sealed-off section, that as a child she'd played in the guild's basements, that she'd seen the door. Heavy. Stone. With a seal that glowed blue. That she asked her uncle what was behind the door. Her uncle told her not to go there. She didn't go, but she remembered where the door was. Dan asked if there was another way to get in. Mirabelle thought about it. Then she said that the guild's basements were old catacombs, that they went deep, that some passages led to the river, that as a child she had found a way out to the riverbank through a crack in the wall. A little girl could squeeze through, an adult couldn't, but it could be widened. Dan said there was no need to widen it, that he needed a different approach, an engineering one. He took out a notebook and started drawing, a floor plan of the basements based on Mirabelle's description. Approximate depth, approximate location of the sealed section, wall thickness, type of stone. He wasn't going to break down the wall. He was going to figure out the structure, figure out where the loads were directed, to figure out where the weak spots were, not to destroy it, to find an alternative route. Every old building has secrets, ventilation shafts, drainage channels, voids in the walls. The builders of the past didn't leave them there on purpose. They were part of the design. Dan knew where to look. 3 nights later, they found the entrance, an old drainage channel beneath the guild's eastern wall. It led out to the river, filled with trash, but passable. Dan and Mirabelle made their way through the channel at night. Holt followed them with a sword and an expression that said she'd kill Dan before the guild did. The channel led to a basement. The basement was empty. Dust, cobwebs, old crates. Mirabelle led the way from memory. Left, straight ahead, down the stairs, left again, a door. The one. Stone, a seal, a blue glow. Dan touched the seal. Just an ordinary stone on the outside, but inside, something was humming. Magic. He couldn't open that door. He wasn't a mage. Mirabelle could. She placed her hand on the seal, closed her eyes. Her face paled. She said the seal was old, very old, unlike anything she'd been taught. A different structure, a different language of runes. But the principle was the same. A lock. It needs a key. The key is a combination of runic frequencies. She doesn't know the combination, but she can see the lock's structure. 4 levels. She can figure out the first 2. She doesn't have enough power for the 3rd. She doesn't even understand the 4th. Dan looked at the door, at the seal, at the stone around it, and he saw something. Hinges. Stone hinges. The door was made of stone, but it was hanging on something. The hinges were set into the wall. The wall was ordinary. No seal, no magic. Ordinary sandstone on lime mortar. 300 years old. Whoever placed the magical seal on the door didn't think about the fact that the wall next to the door was ordinary. Because a mage thinks about magic. An engineer thinks about construction. Dan took out a knife. He began chipping away at the mortar around the hinge. The 300-year-old lime mortar from 100 years ago crumbled easily. 20 minutes later, the top hinge was free. 40 minutes later, both were. Dan and Holt leaned against the door and pushed it aside. They didn't open it. They removed it. The seal still glowed. The door was still locked. But it no longer stood in the doorway. Behind the door was a room. Small. Stone walls. A single table. A box on the table. Scrolls in the box. Dan unrolled the first one. A protocol. Detailed. Date. Name. Description of the alien. Abilities. Method of elimination. Executor. The executor's name was the same in all 15 protocols. Archon. Not a name. A title. A position. Someone in the guild had held that title for 300 years, passing it from one to another. Or... Dan looked at the dates. The handwriting in all the protocols was identical. Not similar. Identical. The same person. 300 years. Mirabel stood behind him and read. She whispered that it was impossible, that no mage lives 300 years. Dan rolled up the protocols, took them all, put them in his bag. He said it was time to leave. They went out the same way, the drainage canal, the river, night. Dan carried the bag with the scrolls and thought that somewhere in this city there lived a creature 300 years old, one that had killed 15 people like him, and one that knew he was here. The bridge across the gray wreck was finished, and Sora had calculated one of the arches on her own. Eliza found a list of 15 time travelers killed over the past 300 years. Dan had entered the sealed section of the guild's basement through a drainage channel, removing the door from its hinges instead of breaking the magical seal. Inside, he discovered the protocols for the extermination of the transdimensional travelers, signed by a single creature named Archon, who had been alive for 300 years. Dan hadn't slept for 3 nights. He read the records, every single one, word for word. Mirabel translated the ancient runic language of the notes in the margins. Linnea was silent, sharpening a knife. Heijin sat by the door and let no one in. Holt stood outside with a sword. Eliza arrived in the early morning of the 3rd day. She sat down next to him. She read along with him. The protocols were detailed. The Archon described each intruder as a task, abilities, weaknesses, circle of contacts, method of recruiting agents around the target, method of elimination. Alaric lasted the longest, 7 years. He managed to build an aqueduct and 3 bridges before he was captured. The Archon wrote about him with something resembling respect. He wrote that Alaric was the most dangerous because he didn't just build, he taught. He had students. When Alaric was burned, his students were scattered, but one of them managed to hide the blueprints in the library, that very box that Eliza found. The student also died. A year later, he fell from the tower. Dan closed the last scroll. He looked at Eliza. He said he had 2 options, to run or to stay and fight. But not with a sword. He doesn't know how to fight with a sword. To fight with what he knows, with documents, with facts, with publicity. The Archon killed in silence. Every murder looked like an accident or a lawful execution. The protocols prove it. If they're brought to light, the silence will end. Eliza said a trial, a royal trial, the protocols as evidence, an indictment against the guild, not against Wayne, against the structure, against the secrecy. Dan said the records alone aren't enough. We need to prove that the guild is involved in the collapse of the towers, not just Edelweiss, all of them. That their business model is based on buildings falling. Because if buildings don't fall, mages aren't needed, and someone is making sure the buildings keep falling. Eliza turned pale. Then she said that this was a charge of treason. If he proved it, the guild wouldn't just lose its license, its leadership would be executed. Dan said he didn't want executions. He wanted the truth. And he wanted his students to be able to build without looking over their shoulders. Preparing for the trial took 3 months. Dan worked every day. In the mornings at the construction site of the first 4-story apartment building in Conneholm. In the evenings, poring over documents. The building rose floor by floor, a stone first floor, a wooden frame for the 2nd and 3rd floors, a stone 4th floor, stove heating with piping to each room, chimneys inside the walls, windows with glass, real glass. Dan found a glass blower at the market and, in a week, taught him how to cast flat glass instead of bubbles. Not perfect, with ripples and bubbles, but light got through, and the cold didn't get through. Plumbing. He didn't want lead pipes. He knew how that ended. Ceramic pipes. Clay-fired and glazed on the inside. A tank on the roof. Water flowing by gravity through the pipes. A simple system. Reliable. Toilets on every floor. With cesspools outside the house. With a water seal. That very bend in the pipe he'd once told Elise about. Elise had blushed then. Now she herself was explaining the principle of the water seal to the treasurer with an impassive face, and the treasurer was blushing in her place. The house was ready by the end of the second year. 4 stories, 12 apartments, a communal kitchen on every floor, a courtyard, a well, a laundry room. Dan stood on the steps and watched the line of people who had come to look. The line stretched from the house to the market square. The king arrived. He gave a speech. Dan wasn't listening. He went up to the 4th floor. He turned on the faucet in the communal kitchen. A ceramic faucet, a simple valve. He turned it. Water flowed from the faucet, clean. From the tank on the roof, down the pipes, by gravity. Dan stood and watched the water. The elderly refugee woman who lived on the 1st floor followed him upstairs. She saw the water. She held her hand under the stream and began to cry, silently. Because for the last 10 years, she'd been hauling buckets from the river, every day, twice a day, up the hill, with a bad back. Now the water was flowing on its own. Dan took off his hard hat, sat down on the step, watched the water. And for the first time in 2 years in this world, he thought that maybe he was home. That evening, Holt brought news. Bad news. The guild had filed a counterclaim. Charges against Dan. Illegal construction, illegal production of materials, illegal teaching, undermining national security, incitement to rebellion, insulting the Rune Order. 12 counts. Each one carried a sentence of prison or exile. Holt said the trial was in 3 weeks. Dan nodded. He opened the bag of records. He looked at Holt and said he was ready, that he'd been ready 3 months ago, that every stone on every one of his construction sites was documented, every coin accounted for. Every permit was signed. Every threat from the guild was recorded with the date and name. He's an engineer. He calculates everything with a margin of safety, including the evidence. Holt looked at him and shook her head. Then she said he was the strangest person she'd ever met. Then she said she'd go with him to court, as a witness, as a bodyguard, as whatever. Because 2 years ago, he repaired the bridge at her outpost, and she promised to take him to the king. She did. Now she'd take him to court. Dan looked at her. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes were warm. He said thank you. She said you're welcome, and left. Dan spent 3 months preparing for the trial while simultaneously building the first 4-story apartment building with running water, glass windows, and a sewer system. At the building's opening, water flowed from a faucet on the 4th floor, and the elderly refugee woman began to cry. The guild filed a counterclaim with 12 charges, but Dan declared he was ready because he had documented every step from day one. The trial took place in the town hall's great hall, not in the palace, at City Hall, because this was a court of the kingdom, not a court of the crown. The difference was important, Eliza explained. A court of the crown is the king's will. A court of the kingdom is the law. The law is stronger than will, even the king's. The hall was full. Aristocrats, mages, merchants, common folk in the gallery. Dan sat at the table on the left, Eliza beside him. Behind them, Holt, Linnea, Ha-Jin, Mirabelle, Sora, the whole team. On the right sat Master Cedric Vane. Beside him, 2 mage advisors and the guild's lawyer, old, experienced, cold. The king sat on a dais. He did not judge. He observed. 3 Lord Magistrates presided, independent, appointed by the Council of Lords. Dan did not trust their independence, but there was no choice. The guild lawyer began first. He listed 12 charges. Each sounded convincing. Illegal construction without a rune license. Fact. Dan built without a license. Illegal production of materials. Fact. The kiln for firing clinker was not registered in the guild registry. Illegal training. Fact. Cross's school did not have a license to train builders. Every point was backed up by documents, seals, references to statutes and decrees the guild had prepared, long and thoroughly. Dan listened and nodded. Then he stood up. He took out his bag. He placed a stack of papers on the table, and he began. Not with a defense, with an attack. He said that 2 years ago, the Silver Tower of Edelweiss had collapsed. 41 people had died. Among them was Princess Katarina. The guild had declared the cause to be the depletion of runes. A commotion arose in the hall. Dan continued. He said he had brought fragments of the tower with him, that he had examined them, that he could show the court the exact cause of the collapse. He took 2 stones out of his bag. He placed them on the table. One was whole, one was cracked. He pointed to the crack. He explained. This crack wasn't caused by time, not from the runes. This crack is from improper load distribution. The tower's foundation was laid with a flaw. The base is too narrow for such a height. He unfolded a blueprint. He showed the calculations. He showed exactly where the load exceeded the stone's strength. He showed that the tower was doomed not in 100 years, from day one. The hall fell silent. Dan continued. He said he had found the tower's design documents in the Treasury archives. The name of the mage who designed it was listed in the documents. The tower was designed by a young mage named Cedric Vane 40 years ago. The room erupted, shouts, clattering. The magistrates demanded silence. Vane sat motionless, as white as the wall behind him. Dan didn't look at him. He looked at the magistrates. He continued. He said he did not accuse Wayne of intent, that the young mage 40 years ago did not know what an engineer knows, that the mistake was a mistake, not a crime, but that the guild had covered up this mistake. When the tower collapsed, the guild knew the cause, and instead of admitting it, they blamed the runes and tripled the prices. Because if the cause was the runes, then more runes were needed. And if the cause was a calculation, then runes weren't needed at all, and the guild would lose everything. He placed the records from the sealed room on the table, one after another. 15. 300 years. 15 people killed for knowing how to build without magic. The hall fell silent. The magistrates read the records, at length. The guild's lawyer tried to object. He claimed the documents were forgeries, that they had been stolen from the guild, that it was illegal entry. Dan agreed. He said yes. He had broken into the guild's basement, illegally, through the drainage shaft. He'd taken the door off its hinges. He'd taken the documents. He was ready to take responsibility for that. But the documents were genuine. Let the court order an expert examination. Let them check the ink. Let them check the parchment. Let them check the magical signature on the seals. He would wait. The magistrates exchanged glances. The senior magistrate called a recess. During the recess, Wayne approached Dan, alone, without his advisors. The old man stood before him and said nothing. Then he asked quietly, so that only Dan could hear, "Is it true about the foundation?" Dan showed him the calculations, silently. Wayne looked at the numbers, at the arrows, at the load lines, for a long time. Then he said one word quietly. "Gods." And 2 more. "I killed her." He was talking about Princess Katarina. He was talking about the 17-year-old girl who had climbed to the top floor to look at the swallows' nests, and the tower he had built 40 years ago had killed her. Wayne sat down on a bench. He covered his face with his hands. An old man, tired, broken. Not an enemy. He had never been an enemy. He was a man who feared that the world would change and he would find himself unnecessary. The world had changed, and he was guilty of something worse than being unnecessary. Dan stood nearby and said nothing. Then he sat down next to him. He didn't say anything. He just sat there. 10 minutes later, Wayne took his hands away from his face. His eyes were red. He asked what an archon was. Dan said he didn't know. He only knew that this creature lived for 300 years and killed people like him. Wayne nodded. Then he said quietly that 20 years ago, a new member had appeared on the guild council. An old mage. No one remembered where he came from. No one remembered when he was accepted. He was simply there, always. His name was Master Oren. Quiet, unobtrusive. But every time the council made a decision, Master Oren was there, and the decision was always in favor of the monopoly. Wayne said he couldn't prove that Oren was the Archon, but that Oren had disappeared from the guild on the day Dan took the minutes. The trial resumed. The magistrates read the verdict. The minutes were deemed authentic pending the completion of the expert examination. The charges against Dan were dropped on 7 of the 12 counts. An additional hearing was scheduled for the remaining 5. The Tower Mages Guild was stripped of its monopoly on construction by a royal decree signed in the courtroom. Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations.